Chapter 47. Joe's Will. As Alan Woodcourt and Joe proceeded along the streets where the high church spires and the distances are so near and clear in the morning light that the city itself seems renewed by rest, Alan revolves in his mind how and where he shall bestow his companion. It surely is a strange fact, he considers, that in the heart of a civilized world, this creature in human form should be more difficult to dispose of than an unknown dog. But it is none the less a fact because of its strangeness, and the difficulty remains. At first he looks behind him often to assure himself that Joe is still really following. But look where he will, he still beholds him close to the opposite houses, making his way with his wary hand from brick to brick and from door to door, and often as he creeps along, glancing over at him watchfully. Soon satisfied that the last thing in his thoughts is to give him the slip, Alan goes on, considering with a less divided attention what he shall do. A breakfast stall at a street corner suggests the first thing to be done. He stops there, looks round, and beckons Joe. Joe crosses and comes halting and shuffling up, slowly scooping the knuckles of his right hand round and round in the hollowed palm of his left, kneading dirt with a natural pestle and mortar. What is a dainty repast to Joe is then set before him, and he begins to gulp the coffee and to gnaw the bread and butter, looking anxiously about him in all directions as he eats and drinks, like a scared animal. But he is so sick and miserable that even hunger has abandoned him. "I thought I was almost a starving, sir," says Joe, soon putting down his food. "I don't know nothing, not even that. I don't care for eating wittles, nor yet for drinking on 'em." And Joe stands shivering and looking at the breakfast wonderingly. Alan Woodcourt lays his hand upon his pulse on his chest. "Draw breath, Joe." "It draws," says Joe, "as heavy as a cart." He might add, and rattles like it, but he only mutters, "I'm moving on, sir." Alan looks about for an apothecary's shop. There is none at hand, but a tavern does as well or better. He obtains a little measure of wine and gives the lad a portion of it very carefully. He begins to revive almost as soon as it passes his lip. "We may repeat that dose, Joe," observes Alan, after watching him with his attentive face. "So now we'll take 5 minutes' rest, and then go on again." Leaving the boy sitting on the bench of the breakfast stall, with his back against an iron railing, Alan Woodcourt paces up and down in the early sunshine, casting an occasional look towards him without appearing to watch him. It requires no discernment to perceive that he is warmed and refreshed. If a face so shaded can brighten, his face brightens somewhat, and by little and little he eats the slice of bread he had so hopelessly laid down. Observant of these signs of improvement, Alan engages him in conversation, and elicits, to his no small wonder, the adventure of the lady in the veil, with all its consequences. Joe slowly munches as he slowly tells it. When he has finished his story and his bread, they go on again. Intending to refer his difficulty in finding a temporary place of refuge for the boy to his old patient, zealous little Miss Flite, Alan leads the way to the court where he and Joe first foregathered. But all is changed at the rag and bottle shop. Miss Flite no longer lodges there. It is shut up, and a hard-featured female, much obscured by dust, whose age is a problem, but who is indeed no other than the interesting Judy, is tart and spare in her replies, these sufficing, however, to inform the visitor that Miss Flite and her birds are domiciled with a Mrs. Blinder in Bell Yard. He repairs to that neighbouring place where Miss Flite, who rises early that she may be punctual at the divan of justice held by her excellent friend the Chancellor, comes running downstairs with tears of welcome and with open arms. "My dear physician," cries Miss Flite, "my meritorious, distinguished, honourable officer." She uses some odd expressions, but is as cordial and full of heart as sanity itself can be, more so than it often is. Alan, very patient with her, waits until she has no more raptures to express, then points out Joe trembling in a doorway, and tells her how he comes there. "Where can I lodge him hereabouts for the present? Now you have a fund of knowledge and a good sense, and can advise me." Miss Flite, mighty proud of the compliment, sets herself to consider, but it is long before a bright thought occurs to her. Mrs. Blinder is entirely let, and she herself occupies poor Gridley's room." "Gridley!" exclaims Miss Flite, clapping her hands after a 20th repetition of this remark. "Gridley, to be sure, of course. My dear physician. General George will help us out." It is hopeless to ask for any information about General George, and would be, though Miss Flite had not already run upstairs to put on her pinched bonnet and her poor little shawl, and to arm herself with a reticule of documents. But as she informs the physician in her disjointed manner on coming down in full array that General George, whom she often calls upon, knows her dear Fitz Jarndyce, and takes a great interest in all connected with her, Alan is induced to think that they may be in the right way. So he tells Joe, for his encouragement, that this walking about will soon be over now, and they repair to the General's. Fortunately, it is not far. From the exterior of George's shooting gallery, and the long entry in the bare perspective beyond it, Alan Woodcote augurs well. He also descries promise in the figure of Mr. George himself, striding towards him in his morning exercise, with his pipe in his mouth, no stock on, and his muscular arms developed by broadsword and dumbbell, weightily asserting themselves through his light shirt sleeves. "Your servant, sir," says Mr. George with a military salute, good-humouredly smiling all over his broad forehead up to his crisp hair. He then defers to Miss Flite, as with great stateliness and at some length she performs the courtly ceremony of presentation. He winds up with another "Your servant, sir," and another salute. "Excuse me, sir, a sailor, I believe," says Mr. George. "I'm proud to find I have the air of one," returns Alan, "but I am only a sea-going doctor." "Indeed, sir, I should have thought you was a regular bluejacket myself." Alan hopes Mr. George will forgive his intrusion the more readily on that account, and particularly that he will not lay aside his pipe, which, in his politeness, he has testified some intention of doing. "You're very good, sir," returns the trooper, "as I know by experience that it's not disagreeable to Miss Flite, and since it's equally agreeable to yourself," and finishes the sentence by putting it between his lips again. Alan proceeds to tell him all he knows about Joe, unto which the trooper listens with a grave face. "And that's the lad, sir, is it?" he inquires, looking along the entry to where Joe stands staring up at the great letters on the whitewashed front, which have no meaning in his eyes. "That's he," says Alan, "and Mr. George, I am in this difficulty about him. I am unwilling to place him in a hospital, even if I could procure him immediate admission, because I foresee that he would not stay there many hours if he could be so much as got there. The same objection applies to a workhouse. Supposing I had the patience to be evaded and shirked, and handed about from post to pillar, in trying to get him into one, which is a system that I don't take kindly to." "No man does, sir," returns Mr. George. "I am convinced that he would not remain in either place, because he is possessed by an extraordinary terror of this person who ordered him to keep out of the way. In his ignorance he believes that this person to be everywhere, and cognizant of everything." "I ask your pardon, sir," says Mr. George, "but you have not mentioned that party's name. Is it a secret, sir?" "The boy makes it one, but his name is Bucket." "Bucket the detective, sir?" "The same man." "The man is known to me, sir," returns the trooper, after blowing out a cloud of smoke and squaring his chest. "And the boy is so far correct that he undoubtedly is a rum customer." Mr. George smokes with a profound meaning after this, and surveys Miss Flite in silence. I wish Mr. Jarndyce and Miss Summerson at least to know that this Joe, who tells so strange a story, has reappeared, and have it in their power to speak with him should they desire to do so. Therefore I want to get him for the present moment into any poor lodging kept by decent people where he would be admitted. "Decent people and Joe, Mr. George," says Alan, following the direction of the trooper's eyes along the entry, "have not much been acquainted, as you see. Hence the difficulty. Do you happen to know anyone in this neighbourhood who would receive him for a while, on my paying for him beforehand?" As he puts the question, he becomes aware of a dirty-faced little man standing at the trooper's elbow, and looking up with an oddly twisted figure and countenance into the trooper's face. After a few more puffs at his pipe, the trooper looks down askant at the little man, and the little man winks up at the trooper. "Well, sir," says Mr. George, "I can assure you that I would willingly be knocked on the head at any time, if it would be at all agreeable to Miss Summerson, and consequently I esteem it a privilege to do that young lady any service, however small. We are naturally in the vagabond way here, sir, both myself and Phil. You see what the place is. You're welcome to a quiet corner of it for the boy, if the same would meet your views. No charge made, except for rations. We're not in a flourishing state of circumstances here, sir. We're liable to be tumbled out neck and crop at a moment's notice. However, sir, such as the place is, and so long as it lasts, here it is at your service." With a comprehensive wave of his pipe, Mr. George places the whole building at his visitor's disposal. "I take it for granted, sir," he adds, "you being one of the medical staff, that there is no present infection about this unfortunate subject." Allen is quite sure of it. "Because, sir," says Mr. George, shaking his head sorrowfully, "we've had enough of that." His tone is no less sorrowfully echoed by his new acquaintance. "Still, I am bound to tell you," observes Allen, after repeating his former assurance, "that the boy is deplorably low, and reduced, and he may be, I do not say that he is, too far gone to recover." "Do you consider him in danger, sir?" inquires the trooper. "Yes, I fear so." "Then, sir," returns the trooper in a decisive manner, "it appears to me, being naturally in the vagabond way myself, that the sooner he comes out of the street the better. You, Phil, bring him in." Mr. Squad tacks out, all on one side, to execute a word of command, and the trooper, having smoked his pipe, lays it by. He is not one of Mrs. Pardiggle's Tockahoopo Indians. He is not one of Mrs. Jellyby's lambs, being wholly unconnected with Borraboola Gha. He is not softened by distance and unfamiliarity. He is not a genuine foreign-grown savage. He is the ordinary home-made article, dirty, ugly, disagreeable to all the senses, in body a common creature of the common streets, only in soul a heathen. Homely filth begrimes him, homely parasites devour him, homely sores are in him, homely rags are on him. Native ignorance, the growth of English soil and climate, sinks his immortal nature lower than the beasts that perish. Stand forth, Joe, in uncompromising colours. From the sole of thy foot to the crown of thy head, there is nothing interesting about thee. He shuffles slowly into Mr. George's gallery, and stands huddled together in a bundle, looking all about the floor. He seems to know that they have an inclination to shrink from him, partly for what he is, and partly for what he has caused. He too shrinks from them. He is not of the same order of things, not of the same place in creation. He is of no order, no place, neither of the beasts nor of humanity. "Look here, Joe," says Allen, "this is Mr. George." Joe searches the floor again for some time longer, then looks up for a moment and then down again. "He's a kind of friend to you. He's going to give you a lodging room here." Joe makes a scoop with one hand, which is supposed to be a bow. After a little more consideration and some backing and changing on the foot for which he rests, he mutters, "Very thankful. You're quite safe here. All you have to do at present is to be obedient and to get strong. And mind you tell us the truth here, whatever you do, Joe." "Wish I may die if I don't, sir," says Joe, reverting to his favourite declaration. "I never done nothing yet but you knows on, to get myself into no trouble. I never was in no other trouble at all, sir, 'cept not knowing nothing and starvation." "I believe it. Now attend to Mr. George. I see he's going to speak to you." "My intention merely was, sir," observes Mr. George, amazingly broad and upright, "to point out to him where he can lie down and get a thorough good dose of sleep. Now look here." As the trooper speaks, he conducts them to the other end of this gallery and opens one of the little cabins. "There you are, you see. Here's a mattress, and here you may rest on good behaviour as long as Mr. I ask your pardon, sir." He refers apologetically to the card Allen has given him. "Mr. Woodcock pleases. Don't you be alarmed if you hear shots. They'll be aimed at the target and not you. Now there's another thing I would recommend, sir," says the trooper, turning to his visitor. "Phil, come here." Phil bears down upon them according to his usual tactics. "Here is a man, sir, who was found when a baby in the gutter. Consequently, it is to be expected that he takes a natural interest in this poor creature. You do, don't you, Phil?" "Certainly and surely I do, governor," is Phil's reply. "Now I was thinking, sir," says Mr. George, in a martial sort of confidence, as if he were giving his opinion in a council of war at a drumhead, that if this man was to take him to a bath, was to lay out a few shillings in getting him one or two coarse articles. Mr. George, my considerate friend, returns Allan, taking out his purse, it is the very favour I would have asked. Phil Squad and Joe are sent out immediately on this work of improvement. Miss Flite, quite enraptured by her success, makes the best of her way to court, having great fears that otherwise her friend, the Chancellor, may be uneasy about her, or may give the judgment she has so long expected in her absence, and observing which, you know, my dear physician and general, after so many years, would be too absurdly unfortunate. Allan takes the opportunity of going out to procure some restorative medicines, and obtaining them near at hand, soon returns to find the trooper walking up and down the gallery, and to fall into step and walk with him. "I take it, sir," says Mr. George, "that you know Miss Summerson pretty well." "Yes, it appears." "Not related to her, sir?" "No, it appears." "Excuse the apparent curiosity," says Mr. George. "It seemed to me probable that you might take more than a common interest in this poor creature, because Miss Summerson has taken that unfortunate interest in him." "'Tis my case, sir, I assure you." "And mine, Mr. George." The trooper looks sideways at Allan's sunburnt cheek and bright dark eye, rapidly measures his height and build, and seems to approve of him. "Since you've been out, sir, I've been thinking that I unquestionably know the rooms in Lincoln's Inn Fields, where Bucket took the lad, according to his account. Though he's not acquainted with the name, I can help you to it. It's Tulkinghorn, that's what it is." Allan looks at him inquiringly, repeating the name. "Tulkinghorn? That's a name, sir. I know the man. I know him to have been in communication with Bucket before, respecting a deceased person who had given him offence. I know the man, sir, to my sorrow." Allan naturally asks what kind of a man he is. "What kind of a man? Do you mean to look at?" "I think I know that much of him. I mean to deal with. Generally, what kind of a man?" "Why, then, I'll tell you, sir," returns the trooper, stopping short and folding his arms square on his chest, so angrily that his face fires and flushes all over. "He is a confoundedly bad kind of man. He is a slow, torturing kind of man. He is no more like flesh and blood than a rusty old carbine is. He is a kind of man, by George, that has caused me more restlessness, more uneasiness, and more dissatisfaction with myself than all other men put together. That's the kind of man Mr. Tulkinghorn is." "I'm sorry," says Allan, "I have touched so sore a place." "Sore?" The trooper plants his legs wider apart, wets the palm of his broad right hand, and lays it on the imaginary moustache. "No fault of yours, sir, but you shall judge. He's got a power over me. He is the man I spoke of just now as being able to tumble me out of this place, neck and crop. He keeps me on a constant seesaw. He won't hold off. He won't come on. If I have a payment to make him, or time to ask him, or anything to go to him about, he don't see me, don't hear me, passes me on to Melchisedec's in Clifford's Inn. Melchisedec's in Clifford's Inn passes me back again to him. He keeps me prowling and dangling about him as if I were made of the same stone as himself. Why, I spend half my life now, pretty well, loitering and dodging about his door. What does he care? Nothing. Just as much as the rusty old carbine I've compared him to. He chafes and goads me till... nonsense. I'm forgetting myself, Mr. Woodcourt." The trooper resumes his march. "All I say is, he is an old man, but I'm glad I shall never have the chance of setting spurs to my horse and riding at him in a fair field. For if I had that chance, in one of the humours he drives me into, he'd go down, sir." Mr. George has been so excited that he finds it necessary to wipe his forehead on his shirt sleeve. Even while he whistles his impetuosity away with the national anthem, some involuntary shakings of his head and heavings of his chest still linger behind, not to mention an occasional hasty adjustment with both hands of his open shirt collar, as if it was scarcely open enough to prevent his being troubled by a choking sensation. Allan Woodcourt has not much doubt about the going down of Mr. Tulkinghorn in the field referred to. Joe and his conductor presently return, and Joe is assisted to his mattress by the careful Phil, to whom, after due administration of medicine by his own hands, Allan confides all needful means and instructions. The morning is by this time getting on apace. He repairs to his lodgings to dress and breakfast, and then, without seeking rest, goes away to Mr. Jarndyce to communicate his discovery. With him Mr. Jarndyce returns alone, confidentially telling him there are reasons for keeping this matter very quiet indeed, and showing a serious interest in it. To Mr. Jarndyce, Joe repeats in substance what he said in the morning without any material variation, only that cart of his is heavier to draw, and draws with a hollower sound. "Let me lay here quiet and not be chivied no more," falters Joe, "and be so kind any person is as a passing nigh when I used to sleep. I'll just say to Mr. Snagsby that Joe, what he known once, is a moving on right forwards with his duty, and I'll be wery thankful. I'd be more than thankful I am already if it was anyways possible for an unfortunate to be it." He makes so many of these references to the law stationer that in the course of a day or two that Allen, after conferring with Mr. Jarndyce, good naturedly resolves to call in Cook's Court, the rather, as the cart seems to be, breaking down. To Cook's Court, therefore, he repairs. Mr. Snagsby is behind his counter in his grey coat and sleeves, inspecting an indenture of several skins which has just come in from the engrosser's. An immense desert of law hand and parchment, with here and there a resting place for a few large letters to break the awful monotony, and save the traveller from despair. Mr. Snagsby puts up one of these inky wells and greets the stranger with his cough of general preparation for business. "You don't remember me, Mr. Snagsby?" The stationer's heart begins to thump heavily, for his old apprehensions have never abated. It's as much as he can do to answer, "No, sir, I can't say that I do. I should have considered, not to put too fine a point upon it, that I never saw you before, sir." "Twice before," says Allan Woodcock. "Once at a poor bedside, and once—" "It's come, alas," thinks the afflicted stationer, as recollection breaks upon him. Got to a head now, and is going to burst, but he has a sufficient presence of mind to conduct his visitor into the little counting house and shut the door. "Are you a married man, sir?" "No, I'm not." "Would you make the attempt to throw singles," says Mr. Snagsby in a melancholy whisper, "to speak as low as you can, for my little woman is a listening somewheres, or I'll forfeit the business and £500." In deep dejection Mr. Snagsby sits down on his stool, his back against the desk, protesting. "I never had a secret of my own, sir. Can't change my memory without ever having once attempted to deceive my little woman on my account, since she named the day. I wouldn't have done it, sir, not to put too fine a point upon it. I couldn't have done it. I durstn't have done it. Whereas, nevertheless, I find myself wrapped around with secrecy and mystery, till my life is a burden to me." His visitor professes his regret to hear it, and asks him does he remember Joe. Mr. Snagsby answered with a suppressed groan, "Oh, don't he? Well, you couldn't name an individual human being, except myself, that my little woman is more set and determined against than Joe," says Mr. Snagsby. Allan asks why. "Why?" repeats Mr. Snagsby in his desperation, clutching at the clump of hair at the back of his bald head. "How should I know why? But you are a single person, sir, and may you long be spared the task to ask a married person such a question." With this beneficent wish, Mr. Snagsby coughs a cough of dismal resignation, and submits himself to hear what the visitor has to communicate. "There again," says Mr. Snagsby, who, between the earnestness of his feelings and the suppressed tones of his voice, is discoloured in the face. "At it again, in a new direction. A certain person charges me in the solemnest way not to talk of Joe to anyone, even my little woman. Then comes another certain person, in the person of yourself, and charges me in an equally solemn way not to mention Joe to that other person above all other persons. Why, this is a private asylum. Why, not to put too fine a point upon it, this is Bedlam, sir," says Mr. Snagsby. But it is better than he expected after all, being no explosion of the mine below him, or deepening of the pit into which he has fallen, and being tender-hearted and affected by the account he hears of Joe's condition, he readily engages to "look round." As early in the evening as he can manage it quietly, he looks round very quietly when the evening comes, but it may turn out that Mrs. Snagsby is as quiet as a manager as he. Joe is very glad to see his old friend, and says when they are left alone that he takes it uncommon kind as Mr. Snagsby should come so far out of his way on account such as him. Mr. Snagsby, touched by the spectacle before him, immediately lays upon the table £5, that magic balsam for all his kinds of wounds. "And how do you find yourself, my poor lad?" inquires the stationer, with his cough of sympathy. "I'm in luck, Mr. Snagsby, I am," returns Joe. "I don't want for nothing. I'm more comfortable than you can think, Mr. Snagsby. Very sorry that I've done it. I didn't go for to do it, sir." The stationer softly lays down another half-crown, and asks him what it is that he is sorry for having done. "Mr. Snagsby," says Joe, "I went and give an illness to the lady as wasn't the other lady, and none of 'em ever said nothing for me for having done it, on accounts of their being so good and my having been so unfortunate. The lady come herself to see me yesterday, and she says, 'Ah, Joe,' she says, 'we thought we'd lost you. Joe,' she says, and she sits down and smiling so quiet, and don't pass a word, nor yet look down upon me for having done it. She don't, and I turns again the wall. I does, Mr. Snagsby, and Mr. Jarndyce, I see him a forced to turn away his own self. And Mr. Woodcock, he came for to give me something for to ease me, what he's always a doing, day and night. When he come a bending over me and a speaking up so bold, I see his tears a falling, Mr. Snagsby." The stationer deposits another half-crown on the table. "What I was a thinking on, Mr. Sangsbury," proceeds Joe, "was that as you was able to write very large, perhaps." "Yes, Joe, please God," returns the stationer. "Uncommon precious large, perhaps," says Joe with eagerness. "Yes, my poor boy." Joe laughs with pleasure. "What I was thinking of then, Mr. Sangsbury, was that when I was moved on for as ever I could go, and I couldn't be moved no further, whether you might be so good, perhaps, as to write out very large, so that anyone could see it anywheres, that I was very truly hearty sorry that I'd done it, and that I never went for to do it, and that though I didn't know nothing at all, I knowed as Mr. Woodcock once cried over it and was allus grieved over it, and that I hoped he'd be able to forgive me in his mind. If the writing could be made to say very large, he might. I shall say it, Joe, very large." Joe laughs again. "Thank you, Mr. Sangsby. It's very kind of you, sir, and it makes me more comfortable than I was afore." The meek little stationer, with a broken and unfinished cough, slips down his fourth half-crown. He has never been so close to a case requiring so many, and is fain to depart. And Joe and he upon this little earth shall meet no more, no more. For the cart so hard to draw is near its journey's end, and drags over stony ground. All around the clock it labours up the broken steps, shattered and worn. Not many times can the sun rise and behold it still upon its weary road. Phil Squad, with his smoky gunpowder visage, at once acts as a nurse and works as an armourer at his little table in the corner, often looking round and saying with a nod of his green baize cap, in an encouraging elevation of his one eyebrow, "Hold up, my boy, hold up." There too is Mr. Jarndyce many a time, and Alan Woodcock almost always, both thinking much how strangely fate has entangled this rough outcast in the web of very different lights. There too the trooper is a frequent visitor, filling the doorway with his athletic figure, and from his superfluity of life and strength seeming to shed down temporary vigour upon Joe, who never fails to speak more robustly in answer to his cheerful words. Joe is in a sleep or in a stupor to-day, and Alan Woodcock, newly arrived, stands by him, looking down upon his wasted form. After a while he softly seats himself upon the bedside with his face towards him, just as he sat in the law writer's room, and touches his chest and heart. The cart had very nearly given up, but labours on a little more. The trooper stands in the doorway, still and silent. Phil has stopped in a low clinking noise, with his little hammer in his hand. Mr. Woodcock looks round with that grave professional interest and attention on his face, and glancing significantly at the trooper, signs Phil to carry his table out. While the little hammer is next used, there will be a speck of rust upon it. "Well, Joe, what's the matter? Don't be frightened." "I thought," says Joe, who has started and is looking round, "I thought I was in Tom all Alone's again. Ain't there nobody here but you, Mr. Woodcock?" "Nobody." "I ain't took back to Tom all Alone's, am I, sir?" "No." Joe closes his eyes, muttering, "I'm wery thankful." After watching him closely a little while, Alan puts his mouth very near to his ear, and says to him in a low, distinct voice, "Joe, did you ever know a prayer?" "Never knowed nothing, sir." "Not so much as one short prayer?" "No, nothing at all. Mr. Chadbands, he was a praying once at Mr. Snagsby's, and I heard him, but he sounded as if he was speaking to himself and not to me. He prayed a lot, but I couldn't make out nothing on it. Different times there was other gentlemen come down to Tom all Alone's a praying, but they all mostly said as the other ones prayed wrong, or all mostly sounded to be talking to themselves, or passing blame on others and not talking to us. We never knowed nothing. I never know what it was all about. It takes him a long time to say this, and few but an experienced and attentive listener could hear, or hearing, understand him. After a short relapse into sleep or stupor, he makes, of a sudden, a strong effort to get out of bed. "Stay, Joe, what now?" "It's time for me to go to that there burying ground, sir," he returns with a wild look. "Lie down and tell me. What burying ground, Joe?" "Where they laid him, as was very good to me. Very good to me indeed, he was. It's time for me to go down to that there burying ground, sir, and ask to be put along with him. I wants to go there to be buried. He used to say for me, 'I'm as poor as you today, Joe,' he says. I wants to tell him that I'm as poor as him now, and I've come there to be laid along with him. By and by, Joe, by and by." "Thank ye, sir, thank ye, sir. They'll have to get the key of the gate before they can take me in, for it's always locked. There's a step there I used to clean with my broom. It's turned very dark, sir. Is there any light a coming?" "It's coming fast, Joe." The cart is shaken all to pieces, and the rugged road is very near its end. "Joe, my poor fellow, I hear you, sir, in the dark. I'm a groping. Let me catch hold of your hand. Joe, can you say what I say?" "I say anything as you say, sir, for I knows it's good. Our Father, that's very good, sir, which art in heaven." "Art in heaven, is that a light a coming, sir?" "It is close at hand. Hallowed be thy name. Hallowed be thy. The light is come upon the dark benighted way. Dead. Dead, your Majesty, dead, my lords and gentlemen, dead, right reverends and wrong reverends of every order, dead, men and women born with heavenly compassion in your hearts, and dying thus around us every day. Chapter 48. Closing in. The place in Lincolnshire has shut its many eyes again, and the house in town is awake. In Lincolnshire the deadlocks of the past doze in their picture frames, and the low wind murmurs through the long drawing-room, as if they were breathing pretty regularly. In town the deadlocks of the present rattle in their fire-eyed carriages through the darkness of the night, and the deadlock Mercuries, with ashes or hair-powder on their heads, symptomatic of their great humility, loll away the drowsy mornings in the little windows of the hall. The fashionable world, tremendous orb, nearly 5 miles round, is in full swing, and the solar system works respectfully at its appointed distances. Where the throng is thickest, where the lights are brightest, where all the senses are ministered to go with the greatest delicacy and refinement, Lady Dedlock is. From the shining height she has scaled and taken, she is never absent. Though the belief that she of old reposed in herself as one able to reserve whatsoever she would under her mantle of pride is beaten down, though she has no assurance that what she is to those around her she will remain another day. It is not in her nature, when envious eyes are looking on, to yield or droop. They say of her that she has lately grown more handsome and more haughty. The debilitated cousin says of her that she's beauty enough, to set up shop woman, but rather alarming kind, reminding man fact, inconvenient woman, who will get out of bed and bore the establishment. Shakespeare. Mr. Tulkinghorn says nothing, looks nothing. Now, as heretofore, he is to be found in doorways of rooms, with his limp white cravat loosely twisted into its old-fashioned tie, receiving patronage from the peerage, and making no sign. Of all men he is still the last who might be supposed to have any influence upon my lady. Of all women she is still the last who might be supposed to have any dread of him. One thing has been much on her mind since the late interview in his turret room at Chesney Wold. She is now decided and prepared to throw it off. It is morning in the great world, afternoon according to the little sun. The Mercuries, exhausted by looking out of window, are reposing in the hall and hang their heavy heads. The gorgeous creatures, like overblown sunflowers. Like them, too, they seem to run a deal of seed in their tags and trimmings. Celesta in the library has fallen asleep for the good of the country over the report of a parliamentary committee. My lady sits in the room which she gave audience to the young man with the name of Guppy. Rosa is with her, and has been writing for her and reading to her. Rosa is now at work upon embroidery or some such pretty thing. As she bends her head over it, my lady watches her in silence, not for the first time to-day. Rosa. The pretty village face looks brightly up, and seeing how serious my lady is, looks puzzled and surprised. See to the door, is it shut? Yes, she goes to it and returns and looks yet more surprised. I am about to place a confidence in you, child, for I know I may trust your attachment, if not your judgment, in what I am going to do. I will not disguise myself to you at least, but I confide in you. Say nothing to anyone of what passes between us. The timid little beauty promises in all earnestness to be trustworthy. Do you know, Lady Dedlock, asked her, signing to her to bring her chair nearer, do you know, Rosa, that I am different to you from what I am to anyone? Yes, my lady, much kinder, but then I often think I know you as you really are. You often think you know me as I really am? Poor child, poor child. She says it with a kind of scorn, though not of Rosa, and sits brooding, looking dreamily at her. Do you think, Rosa, you are any relief or comfort to me? Do you suppose your being young and natural and fond of me and grateful to me makes it any pleasure to me to have you near me? I don't know, my lady. I can scarcely hope so, but with all my heart I wish it was so. It is so, little one. The pretty face is checked in its flush of pleasure by the dark expression on the handsome face before it. It looks timidly for an explanation. And if I were to say to-day, go, leave me, I should say what would give me great pain and disquiet, child, and what would leave me very solitary. My lady, have I offended you? In nothing. Come here. Rosa bends down on the footstool at my lady's feet. My lady, with that motherly touch of the famous ironmaster knight, lays her hand upon her dark hair and gently keeps it there. I told you, Rosa, that I wished you to be happy, and that I would make you so if I could make anybody happy on this earth. I cannot. There are reasons now known to me, reasons in which you have no part, rendering it far better for you that you should not remain here. You must not remain here. I have determined that you shall not. I have written to the father of your lover, and he will be here to-day. All this I have done for your sake. The weeping girl covers her hand with kisses and says, what shall she do? What shall she do when they are separated? Her mistress kisses her on the cheek and makes no other answer. Now be happy, child. Under better circumstances, be beloved and happy. Ah, my lady, I have sometimes thought, forgive me for being so free, that you are not happy. I? Will you be more so when you have sent me away? Pray, pray, think again. Let me stay a little while. I have said, my child, that what I do for your sake and not my own. It is done. What I am towards you, Rosa, is what I am now, not what I shall be in a little while hence. Remember this and keep my confidence. Do so much for my sake, and thus all ends between us. She detaches herself from her simple-hearted companion and leaves the room. Late in the afternoon, when she next appears upon the staircase, she is in her haughtiest and coldest state, as indifferent as if all passion, feeling, and interest had been worn out in the earlier ages of the world, and had perished from its surface with its other departed monsters. Mercury has announced Mr. Rouncewell, which is the cause of her appearance. Mr. Rouncewell is not in the library, but she repairs to the library. Sir Leicester is there, and she wishes to speak to him first. Sir Leicester, I am desirous, but you are engaged. Oh dear, no, not at all. Only Mr. Tulkinghorn. Always at hand, haunting every place. No relief or security from him for a moment. I beg your pardon, Lady Dedlock. Will you allow me to retire? With a look that plainly says, you know you have the power to remain if you will, she tells him it is not necessary, and moves towards a chair. Mr. Tulkinghorn brings it a little forward for her with his clumsy bow, and retires into a window opposite. Interposed between her and the fading light of day, in the now quiet street, his shadow falls upon her, and he darkens all before her. Even so does he darken her life. It is a dull street under the best conditions, where two long rows of houses stare at each other with that severity that half a dozen of its greatest mansions seem to have been slowly stared into stone rather than originally built in that material. It is a street of such dismal grandeur, so determined not to be condensed into liveliness, that the doors and windows hold a gloomy state of their own in black paint and dust, and the echoing mews behind have a dry and massive appearance, as if they were reserved to stable the stone chargers of noble statues. Complicated garnish of ironwork entwines itself over the flights of steps in this awful street, and from these petrified bowers extinguishers for obsolete flambeaux gasp at the upset gas. Here and there a weak little iron hoop, to which bold boys aspire to throw their friends' caps. Its only present use retains its place among the rusty foliage, sacred to the memory of departed oil. Nay, even oil itself, yet lingering at long intervals in the little observed glass pot, with a knob in the bottom like an oyster, blinks and sulks at the newer lights every night, like its high and dry master in the House of Lords. Therefore there is not much that Lady Dedlock, seated in her chair, could wish to see through the window in which Mr. Tulkinghorn stands, and yet she sends a look in that direction, as if it were her heart's desire to have that figure moved out of the way. Sir Leicester begs his lady's pardon. She was about to say, only that Mr. Rouncewell is here. He is called by my appointment, and that we had better make an end of the question of that girl. I am tired to death of the matter. What can I do to assist? Demands Sir Leicester in some considerable doubt. Let us see him here and have done with it. Will you tell them to send him up? Mr. Tulkinghorn, be so good as to ring. Thank you. Request, says Sir Leicester to Mercury, not immediately remembering the business term. Request the iron gentleman to walk this way. Mercury departs in search of the iron gentleman, finds and produces him. Sir Leicester receives that ferruginous person graciously. I hope you are well, Mr. Rouncewell. Be seated. My solicitor, Mr. Tulkinghorn. My lady was desirous, Mr. Rouncewell. Sir Leicester skilfully transfers him with a solemn wave of his hand. Was desirous to speak with you. I shall be very happy, returns the iron gentleman, to give my best attention to anything Lady Dedlock does me the honour to say. As he turns towards her, he finds that the impression she makes upon him is less agreeable than on the former occasion. A distant, supercilious air makes a cold atmosphere about her, and there is nothing in her bearing, as there was before, to encourage open. Pray, says Lady Dedlock listlessly, may I be allowed to inquire whether anything has passed between you and your son respecting your son's fancy? It is almost too troublesome to her languid eyes to bestow a look upon him as she asks this question. If my memory serves me, Lady Dedlock, I said, when I had the pleasure of seeing you before, that I should seriously advise my son to conquer that fancy. The ironmaster repeats her expression with a little emphasis. And did you? Oh, of course I did. Sir Leicester gives a nod, approving and confirmatory. Very proper. The iron gentleman, having said that he would do it, was bound to do it. No difference in this respect between the base metals and the precious. Highly proper. And pray has he done so? Really, Lady Dedlock, I cannot make you a definite reply. I fear not. Probably not yet. In our condition of life we sometimes couple an intention with our fancies, which renders them not altogether easy to throw off. I think it is rather our way to be in earnest. Sir Leicester has a misgiving that there may be a hidden Wat Tylerish meaning in this expression, and fumes a little. Mr. Rouncewell is perfectly good-humoured and polite, but within such limits evidently adapts his tone to his reception. Because, proceeds my lady, I have been thinking of the subject which is tiresome to me. I am very sorry, I am sure. And also of what Sir Leicester said upon it, which I quite concur. Sir Leicester flattered. And if you can give us the assurance that this fancy is at an end, I have come to the conclusion that the girl had better leave me. I can give you no such assurance, Lady Dedlock, nothing of the kind. Then she had better go. Excuse me, my lady, Sir Leicester considerately interposes, but perhaps this may be doing an injury to the young woman which she has not merited. Here is a young woman, says Sir Leicester, magnificently laying out the matter with his right hand like a service of a plate, whose good fortune it is to have attracted the notice and favour of an eminent lady, and to live under the protection of that eminent lady, surrounded by the various advantages which such a position confers, and which are unquestionably very great. I believe unquestionably very great, sir, for a young woman in that station of life. The question then arises, should that young woman be deprived of these many advantages, and that good fortune simply because she has. Sir Leicester, with an apologetic, dignified inclination of his head towards the ironmaster, winds up his sentence, has attracted the notice of Mr. Rouncewell's son. Now, has she deserved this punishment? Is this just towards her? Is this our previous understanding? I beg your pardon, interposes Mr. Rouncewell's son's father. Sir Leicester, will you allow me? I think I may shorten the subject. Pray dismiss that from your consideration. If you remember anything so unimportant, which is not to be expected, you will recollect that my first thought in the affair was directly opposed to her remaining here. Dismiss the Dedlock patronage from consideration. Oh, Sir Leicester is bound to believe a pair of ears that have been handed down to him through such a family, or he might have mistrusted their report of the iron gentleman's observations. It is not necessary, observes my lady in her coldest manner before he can do anything but breathe amazedly, to enter into these matters on either side. The girl is a very good girl. I have nothing whatever to say against her, but she is so far insensible to her many advantages and her good fortune that she is in love, or supposes she is, poor little fool, and unable to appreciate them. Sir Leicester begs to observe that wholly alters the case. He might have been sure that my lady had the best grounds and reasons in support of her view. He entirely agrees with my lady. The young woman had better go. As Sir Leicester observed, Mr. Rouncewell, on the last occasion when we were fatigued by this business, Lady Dedlock languidly proceeds, we cannot make conditions with you. Without conditions and under present circumstances, the girl is quite misplaced here and had better go. I have told her so. Would you wish to have her sent back to the village, or would you like to take her with you, or what would you prefer? Lady Dedlock, if I may speak plainly, by all means. I should prefer the course which will the soonest relieve you of the encumbrance and remove her from her present position. And to speak as plainly, she returns with the same studied carelessness, so should I. Do I understand that you will take her with you? The iron gentleman makes an iron bow. Sir Leicester, will you ring? Mr. Tulkinghorn steps forward from his window and pulls the bell. I had forgotten you, thank you. He makes his usual bow and goes quietly back again. Mercury, swift, responsive, peers, receives instructions whom to produce, skims away, produces the aforesaid, and departs. Rosa has been crying, and is yet in distress. On her coming in, the ironmaster leaves his chair, takes her arm in his, and remains with her near the door, ready to depart. You are taken charge of, you see, says my lady in a weary manner, and are going away well protected. I have mentioned that you are a very good girl, and you have nothing to cry for. She seems, after all, observes Mr. Tulkinghorn, loitering a little forward with his hands behind him, as if she were crying at going away. Why, she is not well bred, you see, returns Mr. Rouncewell with some quickness in his manner, as if he were glad to have the lawyer to retort upon. She is an inexperienced little thing, and knows no better. If she had remained here, sir, she would have improved, no doubt. No doubt, is Mr. Tulkinghorn's composed reply. Rosa sobs out that she is very sorry to leave my lady, and that she was happy at Chesney Wold, and had been happy with my lady, and that she thanks my lady over and over again. Out, you silly little puss, says the ironmaster, checking her in a low voice, though not angrily. Have a spirit if you are fond of what. My lady merely waves her off with indifference, saying, There, there, child, you are a good girl, go away. Sir Leicester has magnificently disengaged himself from the subject, and retired into the sanctuary of his blue coat. Mr. Tulkinghorn, an indistinct form against the dark street, now dotted with lamps, looms in my lady's view, bigger and blacker than before. Sir Leicester and Lady Dedlock, says Mr. Rouncewell, after a pause of a few moments, I beg to take my leave, with an apology for having again troubled you, though not of my own act, on this tiresome subject. I can very well understand, I assure you, how tiresome so small a matter must have become to Lady Dedlock. I am doubtful of my dealing with it. It is only because I did not at first quietly exert my influence to take my young friend here away without troubling you at all. But it appeared to me, I dare say magnifying the importance of the thing, that it was respectful to explain to you how the matter stood, and candid to consult your wishes and convenience. I hope you will excuse my want of acquaintance with the polite world." Sir Leicester considers himself evoked out of the sanctuary by these remarks. "Mr. Rouncewell," he returns, "do not mention it. Justifications are unnecessary, I hope, on either side." "I am glad to hear it, Sir Leicester, and if I may, by way of a last word, revert to what I said before of my mother's long connection with the family, and the worth it bespeaks on both sides, I would point out this little instance here on my arm, who shows herself so affectionate and faithful in parting, and in whom my mother, I dare say, has done something to awaken such feelings, though of course Lady Dedlock, by her heartfelt interest and her genial condescension, has done much more." If he meant this ironically, it may be truer than he thinks. He points it, however, by no deviation from his straightforward manner of speech, though in saying it he turns towards that part of the dim room where my lady sits. Sir Leicester stands to his parting salutation. Mr. Tulkinghorn again rings. Mercury takes another flight, and Mr. Rouncewell and Rosa leave the house. Then lights are brought in. Discovering Mr. Tulkinghorn still standing in his window with his hands behind him, and my lady sitting with his figure before her, closing up her view of the night as well as the day. She is very pale. Mr. Tulkinghorn, observing it as she rises to retire, thinks, well she may be. The power of this woman is astonishing. She has been acting a part the whole time. But he can act a part too, his one unchanging character. And as he holds the door open for this woman, 50 pairs of eyes, each 50 times sharper than Sir Leicester's pair, should find no flaw in him. Lady Dedlock dines alone in her own room to-day. Sir Leicester has whipped into the rescue of Doodle party and the discomfiture of the Coodle faction. Lady Dedlock asks on sitting down to dinner, still deadly pale, and quite an illustration of the debilitated cousin's text. Whether he has gone out? Yes. Whether Mr. Tulkinghorn has gone yet? No. Presently she asks again, is he gone yet? No. What is he doing? Mercury thinks he is writing letters in the library. Would my lady wish to see him? Anything but that. But he wishes to see my lady. Within a few more minutes he is reported as sending his respects, and could my lady please to receive him for a word or two after her dinner. My lady will receive him now. He comes now, apologising for intruding, even by her permission, while she is at table. When they are alone, my lady waves a hand to dispense of such mockeries. "What do you want, sir?" "Why, Lady Dedlock," says the lawyer, taking up a chair at a little distance from her, and slowly rubbing his rusty legs up and down, up and down, up and down. "I am rather surprised by the course you have taken." "Indeed?" "Yes, decidedly. I was not prepared for it. I consider it a departure from our agreement and your promise. It puts us in a new position, Lady Dedlock. I feel myself under the necessity of saying that I don't approve of it." He stops his rubbing and looks at her with his hands on his knees. Imperturbable and unchangeable as he is, there is still an indefinable freedom in his manner which is new, and which does not escape this woman's observation. "I do not quite understand you." "Oh yes, you do, I think." "I think you do. Come, come, Lady Dedlock, we must not fence and parry now. You know you like this girl." "Well, sir?" "And you know and I know that you have not sent her away for the reasons you have assigned, but for the purpose of separating her as much as possible from, excuse my mentioning it as a matter of business, any reproach and exposure that impend over yourself. Well, sir?" "Well, Lady Dedlock," returns the lawyer, crossing his legs and nursing the uppermost knee, "I object to that. I consider that a dangerous proceeding. I know it to be unnecessary and calculated to awaken speculation, doubt, rumour, I don't know what in the house. Besides, it is a violation of our agreement. You were to be exactly what you were before, whereas it must be evident to yourself, as it is to me, that you have been this evening very different from what you were before." "Why, bless my soul, Lady Dedlock, transparently so." "If, sir," she begins, "in my knowledge of my secret," but he interrupts her. "Now, Lady Dedlock, this is a matter of business. and in a matter of business the ground cannot be kept too clear. It is no longer your secret. Excuse me, that is just the mistake. It is my secret, in trust for Sir Leicester and the family. If it were your secret, Lady Dedlock, we should not be here holding this conversation." "That is very true. If in my knowledge of the secret I do what I can to spare an innocent girl, especially remembering your own reference to her when you told my story to the assembled guests at Chesney Wold, from the taint of my impending shame, I act upon a resolution I have taken. Nothing in the world, and no one in the world, could shake it or could move me." She says this with great deliberation and distinctness, and with no more outward passion than himself. As for him, he methodically discusses his matter of business as if she were any insensible instrument used in business. "Really, then, you see, Lady Dedlock," he returns, "you are not to be trusted. You put the case in a perfectly plain way, and according to the literal fact, and that being the case, you are not to be trusted. Perhaps you may remember that I expressed some anxiety on this same point when we spoke at night at Chesney Wold." "Yes," says Mr. Tulkinghorn, coolly getting up and standing on the hearth. "Yes, I recollect, Lady Dedlock, that you certainly referred to the girl, but that was before we came to our arrangement, and both the letter and spirit of our arrangement altogether precluded any action on your part founded upon my discovery. There can be no doubt about that. As to sparing the girl, of what importance or value is she?" "Spare! Lady Dedlock, here is a family name compromised. One might have supposed that the course was straight on, over everything, neither to the right nor to the left, regardless of all considerations in the way, sparing nothing, treading everything under foot." She has been looking at the table. She lifts up her eyes and looks at him. There is a stern expression on her face, and part of her lower lip is compressed under her teeth. "This woman understands me," Mr. Tulkinghorn thinks as she lets her glance fall again. "She cannot be spared. Why should she spare others?" For a little while they are silent. Lady Dedlock has eaten no dinner, but has twice or thrice poured out water with a steady hand and drunk it. She rises from the table, takes a lounging chair and reclines in it, shading her face. There is nothing in her manner to express weakness or excite compassion. It is thoughtful, gloomy, concentrated. This woman, thinks Mr. Tulkinghorn, standing on the hearth again, a dark object closing up her view, is a study. He studies her at his leisure, not speaking for a time. She too studies something. She too studies something at her leisure. She is not the first to speak, appearing indeed so unlikely to be so, though he stood there until midnight, that even he is driven upon breaking silence. "Lady Dedlock, the most disagreeable part of this business interview remains, but it is business. Our agreement is broken. A lady of your sense and strength of character will be prepared for my now declaring it void and taking my own course." "I am quite prepared." Mr. Tulkinghorn inclines his head. "That's all I have to trouble you with, Lady Dedlock." She stops him as he is moving out of the room by asking, "This is the notice I was to receive? I wish not to misapprehend you." "Not exactly. The notice you were to receive, Lady Dedlock, because the contemplated notice supposed the agreement to have been observed, but virtually the same, virtually the same. The difference is merely in a lawyer's mind." "You intend to give me no other notice?" "You are right. No." "Do you contemplate undeceiving Sir Leicester to-night?" "A home question," says Mr. Tulkinghorn with a slight smile, and cautiously shaking his head at the shaded face. "No, not to-night." "To-morrow?" "All things considered, I had better decline answering that question, Lady Dedlock. If I were to say I don't know when exactly, you would not believe me, and it would answer no purpose. It may be to-morrow. I would rather say no more. You are prepared, and I hold out no expectations which circumstances might fail to justify. I wish you good evening." She removes her hand, turns her pale face towards him as he walks silently to the door, and stops him once again as he is about to open it. "Do you intend to remain in the house any time? I heard you were writing in the library. Are you going to return there?" "Only for my hat. I am going home." She bows her eyes rather than her head. The movement is so slight and curious, and he withdraws. Clear of the room, he looks at his watch, but is inclined to doubt it by a minute or thereabouts. There is a splendid clock upon the staircase, famous, as splendid clocks not often are, for its accuracy. And what do you say? Mr. Tulkinghorn inquires, referring to it. What do you say? If it said, now, don't go home, what a famous clock hereafter! If it said tonight of all nights that it is counted off to this old man of all the young and old men who have ever stood before it, don't go home, with its sharp clear bell. It strikes 7:75 and ticks on again. Why, you are worse than I thought you, says Mr. Tulkinghorn, muttering reproof to his watch. 2 minutes wrong. At this rate you won't last my time. What a watch to return good for evil if it ticked in answer, don't go home. He passes out into the streets and walks on, with his hands behind him, under the shadow of the lofty houses, many of whose mysteries, difficulties, mortgages, delicate affairs of all kinds, are treasured up within his old black satin waistcoat. He is in the confidence of the very bricks and mortar. The high chimney stacks telegraph family secrets to him. Yet there is not a voice in a mile of them to whisper, don't go home. Through the stir and motion of the commoner streets, through the roar and jar of many vehicles, many feet, many voices, with the blazing shop lights lighting him on, the west wind blowing him on, and the crowd pressing him on, he is piteously urged upon his way, and nothing meets him murmuring, don't go home. Arrived at last in his dull room to light his candles and look round and up, and see the Roman pointing from the ceiling. There is no new significance in the Roman's hand to-night, or in the flutter of the attendant groups to give him the late warning, don't come here. It is a moonlit night, but the moon, being past the full, is only now rising over the great wilderness of London. The stars are shining as they shone above the turret leads at Chesney Wold. This woman, as he has of late been so accustomed to call her, looks out upon them. Her soul is turbulent within her. She is sick at heart and restless. The large rooms are too cramped and close. She cannot endure their restraint, and will walk alone in the neighbouring garden. Too capricious and imperious in all she does to be the cause of much surprise in those about her as to anything she does. This woman, loosely muffled, goes out into the moonlight. Mercury attends with the key, having opened the garden gate. He delivers the key into his lady's hands at her request, and is bidden to go back. She will walk there some time to ease her aching head. She may be an hour, she may be more. She needs no further escort. The gate shuts upon its spring with a clash, and he leaves her, passing on into the dark shade of some trees. A fine night, and a bright large moon, and a multitude of stars. Mr. Tulkinghorn, in repairing to his cellar, and in opening and shutting those resounding doors, has to cross a little prison-like yard. He looks up casually, thinking, what a fine night, what a bright large moon, what a multitude of stars. A quiet night too, a very quiet night, when the moon shines very brilliantly. A solitude and stillness seem to proceed from her that influence even crowded places full of life. Not only is it a still night on dusty high roads and on hill summits, whence a wide expanse of country may be seen in repose, quieter and quieter as it spreads away into a fringe of trees against the sky with the grey ghost of a bloom upon them. Not only is it a still night in gardens and in woods and on the river, where the water meadows are fresh and green, and the stream sparkles on amongst pleasant islands, murmuring weirs and whispering rushes. Not only does the stillness attend as it flows where the houses cluster thick, where many bridges are reflected in it, where wharves and shipping make it black and awful, where it winds up from these disfigurements through marshes whose grim beacons stand like skeletons washed ashore, where it expands through the bolder region of rising grounds, rich in cornfield, windmill, and steeple, and where it mingles with the ever-heaving sea. Not only is it a still night on the deep and on the shore, where the watcher stands to see the ship with her spread wings cross the path of light that appears to be presented to only him, but even on this strangest wilderness of London there is some rest. Its steeples and towers and its one great dome grow more ethereal. Its smoky housetops lose their grossness in the pale effulgence. The noises that arise from the streets are fewer and are softened, and the footsteps on the pavements pass more tranquilly away. In these fields of Mr. Tulkinghorn's inhabiting, where the shepherds play on chancery pipes that have no stop, and keep their sheep in the fold by hook and by crook, until they have shorn them exceeding close, every noise is merged, this moonlight night, into a distant ringing hum, as if the city were a vast glass vibrating. What was that? Who fired a gun or pistol? Where was it? A few foot passengers stop and stare about them. Some windows and doors are opened, and people come out to look. It was a loud report, and echoed and rattled heavily. It shook one house, or so a man says who was passing it. It has aroused all the dogs in the neighbourhood, who bark vehemently. Terrified cats scamper across the road. While dogs are yet barking and howling, there is one dog howling like a demon. The church clocks, as if they were startled too, begin to strike. The hum from the streets likewise seems to swell into a shout. But it is soon over. Before the last clock begins to strike 10, there is a lull. When it has ceased, the fine night, the bright large moon, and multitudes of stars are left at peace again. Has Mr. Tulkinghorn been disturbed? His windows are dark and quiet, and his door is shut. It must be something unusual indeed to bring him out of his shell. Nothing is heard of him, nothing is seen of him. What power of cannon might it take to shake that rusty old man out of his immovable composure? For many years the persistent Roman, pointing with no particular meaning from the ceiling, it is not likely that he has any new meaning in him tonight. Once pointing, always pointing, like any Roman, or even Briton, with a single idea. There he is, no doubt, in his impossible attitude, pointing unavailingly all night long. Moonlight, darkness, dawn, sunrise, day. There he is, still eagerly pointing, and no one minds him. But a little after the coming of day come people to clean the rooms, and either the Roman has some new meaning in him not expressed before, or the foremost of them goes wild, for looking up at his outstretched hand, and looking down at what is below it, that person shrieks and flies. The others, looking in as the first one looked, shriek and fly too, and there is an alarm in the street. What does it mean? No light is admitted into the darkened chamber, and people unaccustomed to it enter, and treading softly but heavily, carry a weight into the bedroom and lay it down. There is whispering and wondering all day, strict search of every corner, careful tracing of steps, and careful noting of the disposition of every article of furniture. All eyes look up the Roman, and voices murmur, if only he could tell what he saw. He is pointing at a table with a bottle nearly full of wine, and a glass upon it, and two candles that were blown out suddenly soon after being lighted. He is pointing at an empty chair, and a stain upon the ground that it might be almost covered with a hand. These objects lie directly within his range. An excited imagination might suppose that there was something in them so terrific as to drive the rest of the composition, not only the attendant big-legged boys, but the clouds and flowers and pillars too. In short, the very body and soul of allegory, all the brains it has, stark mad. It happens surely that everyone who comes into the darkened rooms and looks at these things looks up at the Roman, and that he is invested in all eyes with mystery and awe, as if he were a paralysed dumb witness. So it shall happen surely, though many years to come that ghostly story should be told of the stain upon the floor, so easy to be covered, so hard to be got out, and that the Roman, pointing from the ceiling, shall point so long as dust and damp and spiders spare him, with far greater significance than he ever had in Mr. Tulkinghorn's time, and with a deadly meaning. For Mr. Tulkinghorn's time is over for evermore, and the Roman pointed at the murderous hand uplifted against his life, and pointed helplessly at him from night to morning, lying face downward on the floor, shot through the heart.